Hey guys, tonight we step into a normal day that refused to stay normal. This is Pompeii, not at its height, not in legend, but in its last day, moment by moment, as everything quietly begins to fall apart. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The city wakes, as it always does, without urgency, without fear, and, most importantly, without any awareness that it is waking for the last time. A pale morning light stretches over Pompeii, slipping between tiled rooftops and into narrow streets still cool from the night. The air carries the familiar blend of scents: baking bread, damp stone, olive oil, and the faint, ever-present trace of the sea. Inside his bakery, Marcus Lucretius is already at work. He moves with practiced efficiency, hands dusted in flour, sliding loaves into a clay oven that glows like a small, contained sun. The heat presses against his face, but he barely notices. This is routine. This is stability. Outside, a small line has already formed. Early customers who believe, quite reasonably, that today will unfold like every other day before it. Not far away, in a spacious villa, Julia Felix steps into her courtyard. The fountain trickles softly, catching the light. Slaves move quietly around her, sweeping, trimming, adjusting. She pauses, examining a cluster of flowers with mild dissatisfaction. Something about them feels off. Not wrong enough to worry about, just wrong enough to irritate her. In the streets, life gathers momentum. A group of children runs past, laughing too loudly, their sandals slapping against stone. A vendor sets up his stall, arranging fruit with the kind of care usually reserved for religious offerings. Somewhere nearby, a dog barks, then another, then several more, as if something unseen has passed through the city, whispering to them in a language only they understand. Most people ignore it, because ignoring small, uncomfortable details is one of humanity's greatest talents. Above them, Mount Vesuvius stands quietly against the sky. Its slopes are green, almost inviting. No smoke, no fire, nothing dramatic. Just a mountain, like any other, watching over a city that trusts it completely. And why wouldn't they? It has been silent for generations, harmless, predictable. The streets grow busier, voices louder, the rhythm of daily life settling into place. Bread will be sold, deals will be made, meals will be shared, plans will be followed, and not a single person, not Marcus, not Julia, not anyone, has the slightest idea that by nightfall, none of it will matter. Because the mountain is not asleep. It is waiting. At first, it is nothing worth stopping for. A faint tremor passes beneath the city, so slight that many don't notice it at all. Those who do simply pause, glance around, and continue. In Pompeii, the ground has a habit of shifting now and then, like an old man adjusting himself in a chair. Uncomfortable, yes. Alarming, not really. Inside a shaded dining room, Publius Cornelius steadies a cup of watered wine as it trembles against the table. The liquid ripples, then stills. He frowns for a moment, then exhales through his nose. Another one, he mutters, more annoyed than concerned. Across from him, his wife barely looks up. Conversations resume. Bread is broken. Life continues, because life always insists on continuing. Outside, however, the city is beginning to behave differently. A flock of pigeons erupts suddenly into the air, scattering in no clear direction. They do not settle again. A mule refuses to move, digging its hooves stubbornly into the ground while its owner curses and pulls at the reins. Dogs bark. Not in bursts, but constantly now, as if something unseen circles just beyond human awareness. Near the marketplace, Flavia Sabina pauses mid-step. She turns her head slightly, listening. The usual sounds are there. Voices, footsteps, distant laughter. But something underneath feels hollow, thinner, as if the city itself has taken a shallow breath and forgotten to release it. She shakes the feeling off. There are errands to run. There is no time to indulge vague unease. Above it all, Mount Vesuvius remains unchanged. Quiet, still. Its slopes bask under the light, betraying nothing of what is building deep within it. No smoke signals danger. No rumble carries warning. It is, outwardly, the most innocent thing in the world, and that is precisely the problem. Because danger, when it finally arrives, rarely introduces itself properly. In the streets, people continue their routines with stubborn confidence. Shopkeepers call out to customers. Slaves carry water and goods from one end of the city to the other. A pair of men argue loudly over the price of olives, each convinced the other is a criminal mastermind. It would almost be funny if it weren't happening on the edge of catastrophe. The tremors return, slightly stronger this time. A hanging lamp sways. Dust falls gently from a ceiling beam. Again people pause. Again they dismiss it, because acknowledging the pattern would require admitting something far worse than an inconvenience. It would require admitting that this is not random, and Pompeii for now is not ready to admit anything at all. The city presses forward with the quiet stubbornness of routine. If something feels wrong, it is buried beneath habit, noise, and the comforting illusion that life, once started, cannot simply stop without warning. At the Forum, the heart of Pompeii beats loudly. Merchants shout over one another. Each convinced volume is a substitute for persuasion. Coins clink, hands gesture. Deals rise and collapse in the space of minutes. Aulus Umbricius Scarus, one of the city's wealthier men, stands near his stall, inspecting amphorae of his prized garum. The sharp, fermented scent lingers in the warm air. He speaks with authority, negotiating prices with the confidence of someone who has never had to consider losing everything in a single afternoon. Profit, after all, feels permanent when you've never watched it vanish. Nearby, Quintus Padius, a schoolteacher, attempts to maintain order among a group of restless boys. He recites lines, corrects pronunciation, insists on discipline. One child glances toward the sky through an open doorway, distracted by something he can't quite explain. Quintus notices. He follows the boy's gaze. For a moment he says nothing. Then, with quiet determination, he returns to the lesson. Structure must be maintained, even when the world begins to feel uncertain. In another part of the city, Flavia Sabina finally selects a piece of jewellery. She turns it in her hands, examining how the light catches its surface. It pleases her. She smiles faintly, unaware that this small moment of satisfaction will be one of her last uncomplicated thoughts. The tremors continue, subtle but persistent now. A jar shifts slightly on a shelf. A hanging curtain sways when there is no wind. Conversations pause for a heartbeat, then resume with forced normality. No one wants to be the first to say it aloud, because saying it aloud makes it real. Above them, Mount Vesuvius remains deceptively calm. Its silence is no longer comforting. It is heavy, like a held breath stretching just a little too long. The animals, however, have no such hesitation. A horse breaks loose from its tether, bolting down a side street. A cluster of dogs whines and pulls away from their owners. Even the insects seem fewer, their constant hum thinning into something almost noticeable by its absence. Yet still, the city continues. Bread is sold, lessons are taught, jewellery is bought. Because routine is a powerful thing, it convinces people that tomorrow is guaranteed. And in Pompeii, that illusion is holding, barely, against something far stronger, rising just beneath the surface, waiting for the moment when it no longer has to hide. The city begins to feel different, not dramatically, not in a way that demands immediate action, but in the slow, creeping way discomfort settles into the body and refuses to leave. The air grows heavier, not just warm, but thick, as if each breath requires a little more effort than it should. In the public baths, where steam and heat are nothing unusual, even the regulars begin to notice the difference. Titus Vibius, a soldier recently returned from service, leans against a marble wall, sweat gathering faster than it should. He exhales slowly, studying the room. "This isn't right," he mutters, more to himself than to anyone else. Around him, men laugh it off. One blames the late summer sun. Another blames poor ventilation. A third, clearly unwilling to think too deeply, blames the gods in the vague, convenient way people do when they don't actually want an answer. The conversations continue, but they feel thinner now. Forced, stretched over a growing discomfort no one quite wants to name. Outside, the streets shimmer slightly under the rising heat. The usual breeze from the sea has faded, leaving the air stagnant. Even the sounds of the city seem dulled. as if absorbed by something unseen. At a small courtyard, Livia Drusilla sits in the shade, attended by a young slave fanning her gently. She lifts her hand, signaling the girl to stop. The air, for a moment, feels completely still. No wind, no movement, just silence pressing in from all sides. Livia looks up. Not at anything specific. Just up, as if expecting to find an answer written somewhere above her. There is nothing there, only the quiet presence of Mount Vesuvius, watching as it always has, unchanged in appearance, unchanged in posture. A perfect disguise for something that is anything but calm. Elsewhere, small signs begin to accumulate. A clay cup cracks suddenly from the heat, splitting with a sharp sound that makes its owner flinch. A line of ants breaks formation, scattering in erratic patterns. A fountain, once flowing steadily, sputters for a moment before correcting itself. Individually, these things mean nothing. Together they begin to form a pattern. But patterns require recognition, and recognition requires someone willing to stop, step back, and admit that what they're seeing doesn't fit the normal shape of things. Pompeii is not there yet. The city continues to move, to speak, to trade, to exist, held together by routine and expectation. But beneath it all, something is shifting. Not violently, not yet. Just enough to make the world feel slightly out of place. Just enough to warn anyone who is willing to listen. And still, almost no one is. It is no longer easy to ignore. Not because anything dramatic has happened. Nothing has exploded. Nothing has collapsed. But because the small, scattered signs have begun to gather into something heavier. Something that lingers. The animals feel it first. In a narrow side street, a mule refuses to move. Its muscles locked, eyes wide, breath coming too fast. Its owner pulls harder on the reins, voice rising from irritation to anger. But the animal will not obey. It simply stands there, trembling, as if rooted to the earth itself. Nearby, a group of dogs begins howling, not barking, not reacting to anything visible, but howling in long, drawn-out notes that seem to stretch across the city. The sound unsettles people in a way they can't quite explain, because it doesn't sound like warning. It sounds like mourning. In her villa, Livia Drusilla rises from her seat and begins to pace slowly across the courtyard. The silence presses in again, heavier than before. Even the fountain, once a constant background comfort, now feels too loud in the stillness. She stops, listens. Nothing unusual. And yet everything feels wrong. Across town, Marcus Lucretius pauses in his bakery. The ovens burn as they always do, but the heat seems sharper now, almost aggressive. He wipes sweat from his forehead, glancing toward the doorway where a thin layer of dust has begun to settle along the threshold. He frowns. Dust is normal. This much dust without wind? Less so. Still, he says nothing. There are customers waiting. Bread does not bake itself, and concern does not pay for grain. At the forum, conversations have shifted. The usual arguments over price and quality are shorter now, interrupted by glances toward the sky, toward the ground, toward anything that might offer an explanation. No one has one. Above them, Mount Vesuvius remains outwardly unchanged, calm, silent, almost indifferent. It is an impressive performance, because beneath that stillness, pressure continues to build, unseen, unheard, and entirely unstoppable. A faint tremor rolls through the city again, stronger this time. Not enough to cause damage, but enough to be felt by everyone. Cups rattle. Doors shift slightly in their frames. A few people gasp before quickly recovering, brushing it off with forced confidence. It's nothing, someone insists, and others nod, because agreeing is easier than questioning. Because questioning leads somewhere uncomfortable. Because admitting something is wrong means facing the possibility that it cannot be fixed. The city does not stop, but it slows, just slightly, just enough for unease to take hold, quiet, persistent, and growing stronger with every passing moment Pompeii chooses not to listen. The moment arrives without warning, and yet in hindsight it feels inevitable. It begins with a sound, not a rumble, not a crack, something deeper, louder, a violent tearing roar that seems to split the sky itself. It does not roll across the city. It drops onto it, heavy and immediate, leaving no room for confusion. Every voice stops. Every movement freezes. For a single heartbeat, Pompeii holds its breath. Then the city looks up. Above Mount Vesuvius, the sky is no longer empty. A massive column of ash and smoke is rising, fast, impossibly fast, stretching upward like a dark tree forced into the heavens. It expands as it climbs, thick and unnatural, swallowing the blue sky with an ease that feels almost deliberate. For a moment, no one reacts, because the mind struggles to process what it cannot categorize. Quintus Padius, standing just outside the forum, stares upward, his mouth slightly open. His students gather behind him, unusually silent now, their earlier restlessness replaced by something sharper. "What is that?" one of them whispers. Quintus does not answer, because he does not know. Across the city, Flavia Sabina steps into the street, shielding her eyes as she looks toward the mountain. The shape in the sky grows larger, darker, more defined with each passing second. It is no longer distant. It is no longer abstract. It is real. And it is happening now. Then the ground shakes again. Harder this time. Not a tremor, but a jolt. Buildings groan. Tiles shift. A crack runs along a plaster wall with a sharp, final sound. Someone screams. That is what breaks the stillness. Not the explosion. Not the column of ash. The scream. Because fear, once voiced, spreads faster than anything else. People begin to move. Some step backward. Others turn and start walking, then faster, then running without fully understanding why. And then it begins to fall. At first, it is light. Fine ash drifting down from the sky like grey snow. It settles on hair, on shoulders, on the ground, quiet and almost gentle. A few people brush it away, confused more than afraid. Marcus Lucretius, standing at the entrance of his bakery, holds out his hand. The ash collects on his palm, soft and weightless. He stares at it. For a moment it almost seems harmless. Almost. But above them, the column continues to rise, darkening, thickening, spreading wider across the sky. This is no passing disturbance. This is the beginning, and Pompeii finally can no longer pretend otherwise. The ash continues to fall. At first it is almost delicate, soft grains settling across rooftops, drifting into open courtyards, clinging to hair and fabric like an unwelcome but oddly quiet visitor. People brush it away instinctively, as if it were nothing more than dust carried on an unusual breeze. But the breeze never comes. The air remains still, too still. In the street outside his bakery, Marcus Lucretius steps forward, looking up once more. The sky is no longer blue. It has taken on a dull grey tone, as though someone has drawn a veil across it. He squints, trying to make sense of the shape rising above Mount Vesuvius, but the scale of it resists comprehension. It is too large, too sudden, too impossible. So his mind does what minds often do in the face of the impossible. It shrinks it. "It will pass," he says aloud, though no one has asked. A customer nearby nods quickly, eager to agree. "Just ash," the man adds. It happens. Neither of them believes it fully, but belief is not always required, only repetition. Across the city, the same quiet denial takes hold. In the Forum, Aulus Umbricius Scaurus orders his workers to continue loading amphorae. Business must not stop. It cannot stop. Profit depends on continuity, not panic. He wipes ash from his shoulder with visible irritation, as if offended by the inconvenience more than concerned by the cause. Nearby, Flavia Sabina hesitates in the middle of the street, clutching her jewellery box tighter now. The falling ash gathers more quickly, settling into her hair, catching in the folds of her clothing. She looks around, searching for someone. Anyone who seems certain of what to do. There is no one. Only people pretending they know. The tremors continue, stronger, closer together. Doors rattle in their frames. A loose tile slides from a rooftop and shatters against the stone below, drawing startled cries from those nearby. For a moment the illusion cracks. Voices rise. Questions form. But before they can settle into something resembling action, they are pushed aside. Smothered under habit, under routine, under the desperate need for normality. Because accepting reality would require immediate change. And change, especially the kind that demands urgency, is something people resist with remarkable consistency. So they continue. Shops remain open. Conversations continue, though shorter now, more distracted. People move through the streets with quicker steps, casting more frequent glances toward the sky. The ash thickens. The light dims further. And still, many choose to believe this is temporary, that it will stop, that it must stop. Because the alternative, that this is only the beginning, is far too large to accept all at once. And Pompeii, even now, is trying very hard not to accept it at all. The shift, when it comes, is sudden. Denial does not fade gently. It breaks. The ash is no longer soft or occasional. It falls steadily now, thicker, heavier, coating the streets in a grey layer that muffles footsteps and dulls colour. What was once an inconvenience has become an obstruction. Breathing feels different. The air scratches at the throat, and people begin to understand. Not fully, not clearly, but enough. In the forum, voices rise. Not in argument now, but in confusion. Questions overlap, collide, go unanswered. Someone shouts to leave the city. Someone else insists it is safer to stay indoors. A third demands to know who is in charge, as if authority might somehow negotiate with a volcano. No one is in charge. Not here. Not anymore. Flavia Sabina pushes through the crowd, clutching her jewellery box against her chest. It feels heavier now. Less like a possession and more like a burden. Around her, people move faster, bumping into one another, abandoning the careful politeness that once governed the streets. Fear erases manners quickly. Nearby, Aulus Umbricius Scaurus is no longer concerned with profit. His workers hesitate, looking to him for direction. He opens his mouth to speak, then closes it again. For perhaps the first time in years, he has nothing useful to say. Above them, Mount Vesuvius continues its relentless display. The column of ash spreads wider, darker, blotting out more of the sky. Occasional flashes ripple within it. Brief, violent hints of lightning buried inside the cloud itself. It is no longer distant. It feels close. Too close. The ground trembles again, stronger than before. A section of wall cracks and collapses, sending a burst of dust into the already thickening air. People scream. Not the isolated cry from before, but many voices at once, layered and urgent. This time, no one pretends it is nothing. At the edge of a narrow street, Titus Vibius tries to impose order. His voice cuts through the chaos, sharp and commanding, directing people to move, to stay together, to think clearly. Some listen, many do not. Panic does not respond well to instruction. It spreads faster than logic, faster than reason, faster than any attempt to contain it. The ash continues to fall, heavier still. It collects on rooftops, pressing downward, adding weight where structures were never meant to carry it. Doors become harder to open. Pathways begin to disappear beneath the growing layer. The city, once open and familiar, starts to close in on itself. And now, finally, movement becomes urgent, not cautious, not hesitant. People begin to run, because whatever this is, whatever has started, it is no longer something they can wait out. It is something they must escape, or try to. The light fades with unnatural speed. What should be a bright, sunlit day is reduced to a dim, grey twilight. Shadows stretch where they shouldn't. Colours drain from the streets, replaced by the dull uniformity of ash. Then slowly the grey turns to black. Not night, something heavier. A darkness that feels close, pressing in, swallowing distance and depth until the city itself begins to disappear into it. Torches are lit. At first, only a few. Small flames flickering uncertainly in doorways and along the edges of streets. Then more, and more, until Pompeii glows faintly under a scattered constellation of fire, each flame a fragile attempt to hold back something far larger. It doesn't work. The darkness keeps coming. Inside his home, Publius Cornelius gathers his family. The room is dim despite the lamps, their light struggling against the thickening air. Ash slips through open spaces, settling on the floor, the furniture, their clothes. His wife grips his arm. "We need to leave." He hesitates, not because he disagrees, but because he doesn't know where leave leads anymore. Outside? Toward what? The streets are already filling. The sky offers no direction. The mountain looms unseen, hidden behind the growing mass of ash and smoke. Every option feels uncertain. Every delay feels dangerous. In the streets, movement becomes chaotic. People push past one another, their outlines barely visible through the darkness. Voices call out names. Children, spouses, friends, some answered, many not. A child cries somewhere nearby, the sound thin and desperate in the thick air. Across town, Livia Drusilla steps outside her villa, guided by a servant holding a trembling torch. The flame bends and flickers, struggling to stay alive. She looks out toward where the city should be. She sees almost nothing, only shifting shapes, moving shadows, brief flashes of firelight reflecting off falling ash. Above them all, hidden now but still present, Mount Vesuvius continues its work unseen. The eruption feeds the sky, and the sky feeds the darkness, until the boundary between earth and air begins to dissolve. Another tremor rolls through the ground, longer this time, the kind that doesn't end quickly, forcing people to feel every second of it. Walls creak, structures strain. Somewhere in the distance, something collapses with a heavy, final crash. The city is changing, not slowly anymore. Rapidly, irreversibly, breathing becomes harder. Each inhale carries dust and ash, dry and suffocating. People cover their mouths with cloth, with hands, with whatever they can find. It helps, but not enough. Nothing is enough. And now, the question is no longer whether something is wrong. The question is whether anyone can still get out, or if Pompeii has already become a place that traps more than it shelters. The weight of it becomes impossible to ignore. Ash no longer drifts. It falls with purpose, thick and relentless, gathering on rooftops in heavy layers. What once looked like dust now behaves like stone in waiting, compacting, pressing downward with a force the buildings were never meant to endure. The first collapse is sudden. A sharp crack splits the air, followed by the deep grinding sound of wood and tile giving way. A roof caves in under the strain, sending a cloud of ash bursting outward into the already choked streets. People scream, not in confusion now, but in recognition. This is happening! And it is not stopping. Along a narrow street, Titus Vibius moves quickly, his voice cutting through the chaos. He gestures toward open areas, urging people away from buildings, away from walls that may not hold much longer. "Keep moving," he shouts. "Don't stay near the houses." Some listen, stumbling past him, clutching children, dragging belongings, coughing as they move. Others hesitate, unwilling to abandon shelter, even when that shelter is beginning to fail, because stepping into the open feels like stepping into the unknown, and the unknown, at least in theory, can always be worse. Above them, unseen behind the thickened sky, Mount Vesuvius continues to feed the storm. The ash grows denser, falling faster, coating everything it touches. Doorways clog, pathways narrow. The city begins to lose its shape. Its familiar lines softened and buried beneath the accumulating grey. Inside what remains of his bakery, Marcus Lucretius tries to salvage what he can. He wraps bread in cloth, his movements quick, almost frantic now. The oven's heat mixes with the suffocating air, turning the space into something unbearable. A distant crash echoes through the walls, then another, closer this time. He stops, listens. The structure groans above him. For a moment he considers staying. The instinct to protect what is his work, his livelihood, his place in the city, pulls at him with stubborn force. Then a beam shifts with a sharp, splintering sound. That decides it. He drops everything and moves toward the door, stepping out into a street that feels narrower, darker, and far more dangerous than it did before. All across Pompeii, the same decision is being made. Too late for some, just in time for others. And for many, impossible to make at all. The collapses continue, one after another, each one sending shockwaves through the already panicked crowd. Structures that stood for decades give way in minutes, crushed under a weight no one had ever prepared for. The city is not just under attack, it is being buried, piece by piece, breath by breath, under something that will not lift, will not stop, and will not spare anything in its path. Movement becomes the only instinct that matters. The streets, once orderly and familiar, are now crowded with bodies pushing in every direction, each person chasing the same fragile idea. Escape. Not safety, not certainty, just distance. Away from the city, away from whatever this has become. Julia Felix steps out from the remains of her estate, her composure fractured, but not entirely gone. Servants cluster around her, some carrying bundles, others carrying nothing at all. The gates that once marked the boundary of her wealth now feel meaningless. Walls do not protect against falling ash. Nothing does. She hesitates only briefly before moving forward, joining the flow of people pressing toward the edges of Pompeii. Around her, The distinction between classes has dissolved. Wealthy and poor move side by side, equally covered in ash, equally uncertain. Fear is remarkably efficient at levelling society. The roads leading out of the city begin to choke with movement. People stumble over uneven ground now buried beneath layers of ash. Sandals slip, visibility drops further, torches flicker weakly, their light swallowed by the thickened air. Breathing becomes labour. Each inhale drags dust into the lungs, dry and abrasive. People wrap cloth around their mouths, press sleeves against their faces, anything to filter the air. It helps, but only slightly, not enough to make this sustainable. In the crowd, Publius Cornelius grips his son's hand tightly, refusing to let go even as bodies press in from all sides. His wife follows close behind, coughing, her steps growing slower. He glances back once, then forward again. There is no time to stop. Stopping means being overtaken. Stopping means disappearing into the chaos behind them. Above, hidden but ever present, Mount Vesuvius continues to feed the disaster. The ash thickens still, falling faster, heavier, turning the world into something increasingly unrecognizable. The city's edges blur, landmarks vanish. Even the direction of escape becomes uncertain. Some turn back disoriented. Others push forward blindly, trusting movement over thought. A few fall and do not rise again, lost beneath the shifting mass of people and ash. The sound of the city has changed. No longer voices layered over routine noise, but a constant, chaotic mixture of coughing, shouting, footsteps and distant collapses. It is louder, yet somehow emptier, stripped of anything resembling normal life. And still, they move, because staying is no longer an option, because the city behind them is no longer a place to live. It is something else now, something closing in, something that does not release what it takes. And with every step, the hope of escape grows thinner. Not because they stop believing in it, but because the world around them is changing faster than they can outrun it. Darkness takes the city completely, not gradually, not with the familiar fading of daylight, but all at once. Thick, suffocating, absolute. It presses in from every direction, swallowing what little visibility remains until the world shrinks to the reach of an outstretched hand. Torches struggle. Their flames flicker weakly, bending under the weight of ash and the lack of clean air. Light no longer spreads. It clings, small and fragile, barely illuminating the faces of those who carry it. Beyond that narrow circle there is nothing. Only black. In the streets people move blindly now, not running. Running requires direction. This is something else. A slow, uncertain forward motion, guided by instinct, by memory, by the faint hope that each step is leading somewhere better than where they are. It often isn't. Livia Drusilla walks with one hand gripping her servant's arm, the other covering her mouth with a piece of cloth. The fabric is already damp with breath and ash, offering little protection, but it feels necessary. Without it, each inhale burns. "Stay close," she whispers. The servant nods, though neither of them can truly see the other's face. Around them, voices echo in the darkness. Names called out again and again, some answered, most not. The sound carries strangely, distorted by the thick air, making it difficult to tell how far away anyone actually is. A child cries nearby. Then the sound disappears, lost in the movement, lost in the dark. Elsewhere, Marcus Lucretius stumbles forward, his arms extended slightly, feeling for obstacles before they appear. His bakery is gone behind him, swallowed by distance and ash. He no longer thinks about it. There is no room for past or future now, only the next step. Above them all, unseen and relentless, Mount Vesuvius continues to pour ash into the sky, feeding the darkness until it feels less like an absence of light and more like a presence of something else. Something heavy, something final. The ground trembles again, longer this time, more sustained. People freeze, instinctively lowering themselves, bracing for impact. Walls creak. Loose stone shifts underfoot. Somewhere nearby, a structure collapses with a muffled, crushing sound. No one screams this time. There is no energy left for it. Breathing grows harder still. The air is thicker, hotter, more difficult to draw into the lungs. Each inhale feels incomplete, as if something vital has been removed from it. Some begin to slow, not by choice, because their bodies no longer cooperate, and in the darkness slowing down is dangerous, because the city is still moving, still shifting, still collapsing, and those who cannot keep pace are left behind. Not intentionally, not cruelly, but inevitably. The night has come, and it has come far too soon. The air changes again, not in a way that can be seen, but in a way that is immediately felt. Breathing, already difficult, becomes painful. Each inhale burns the throat, scratching deeper, settling into the chest with a weight that does not leave. Coughing spreads through the crowd, dry at first, then harsher, more desperate, until it becomes a constant, relentless sound. The air is no longer just filled with ash. It is turning against them. In the darkness, people slow. Not because they want to, but because their bodies begin to resist movement itself. Legs feel heavier, steps grow shorter. Even standing becomes an effort that demands focus. Aulus Umbricius Scaurus, once confident and loud, now leans against a wall he can barely see. His breaths come shallow and quick, each one followed by a cough he cannot suppress. He tries to push himself upright, to move with the others, but the strength that once defined him is slipping away with every passing moment. Around him, others collapse. Some sink to their knees, others fall entirely, disappearing into the ash-covered ground. A few attempt to rise again, managing a step or two before stopping once more. There is no clear line between those who continue and those who cannot, only a gradual, quiet separation. In the streets, voices weaken, calls for loved ones grow softer, less frequent, replaced by the sound of laboured breathing. Even panic begins to fade, not because the danger is lessened, but because there is no longer enough air to sustain it. Fear requires breath, and breath is becoming scarce. Above, hidden but inescapable, Mount Vesuvius continues its silent assault. The eruption feeds the sky, and the sky feeds the ground, filling every space with heat, ash, and gas that seeps into lungs and refuses to leave. The temperature rises, not dramatically, not enough to burn, yet, but enough to make the air feel wrong, warmer than it should be, closer than it should be, as if the space itself is shrinking. Publius Cornelius struggles forward, his grip on his son weakening. He tightens it again instinctively, refusing to let go. His wife stumbles behind him, her breathing uneven, her steps unsteady. "We have to keep moving," he says, though his voice is barely more than a whisper now. They try, but the distance they hope to create between themselves and the city feels unchanged. Every step forward is met with the same suffocating air, the same darkness, the same uncertainty. There is no clear escape, only the fading hope of one, and as the air grows heavier, hotter and more toxic, the realization begins to settle. Not all at once, but slowly, quietly, like everything else in this day. This is no longer something to outrun. It is something closing in from every side, something that does not need speed, because it takes the very thing required to escape it. And once that is gone, there is very little left to fight with at all. What comes next does not announce itself with warning. There is no time to adjust, no moment to understand, only a change. Subtle at first, almost imperceptible. The air grows hotter, not gradually, not like the slow rise of a summer day, but in a sudden, unnatural shift. The kind that makes the skin prickle, the lungs tighten, the body hesitate without knowing why. Some notice, most do not, because by now there is so much wrong with the world that one more change barely registers. Then the ground trembles again, stronger than before, longer. It does not stop quickly this time, it lingers. A deep, sustained vibration that runs through the stone, through the streets, through the bodies of those still standing. Loose debris shifts. Ash slides in soft cascades from rooftops already weakened beyond recovery, and somewhere beyond the darkness, beyond sight, beyond understanding, something collapses. Not a building, not a wall, something larger. Above it all, hidden but inevitable, Mount Vesuvius releases the force it has been holding back. A surge forms. A fast-moving wave of superheated gas, ash and debris, dense, unstoppable, and far beyond anything the people below can comprehend. It does not move like wind. It does not behave like fire. It advances like a wall, In the streets, there is no clear signal of its arrival, only a growing pressure in the air, a sudden intensification of heat, a feeling that something vast is approaching at impossible speed. Marcus Lucretius stumbles forward, barely able to see, barely able to breathe. He pauses for a moment, instinctively turning his head as if trying to listen for something. There is nothing to hear, no roar, no warning, because it is already too close. Elsewhere, Livia Drusilla grips her servant's arm tightly, her strength fading, her breath shallow. The torch they carry flickers once, twice, then goes out completely. Darkness closes in again. Complete, absolute. For a fraction of a moment, the city holds still, not in calm, in suspension, and then it arrives. The surge moves through Pompeii with devastating speed, filling streets, entering homes, overtaking everything in its path. There is no time to react, no time to run, no time to think. It is not something that can be escaped. It is not something that can be survived. It is the end, delivered in a single overwhelming force, and in that instant, all movement stops. All sound ceases. The city, once alive with voices, footsteps, and breath, falls into a silence deeper than anything it has ever known. Not because the danger has passed, but because nothing remains to hear it. What follows is not peace. It only resembles it. The movement is gone. The voices are gone. The frantic, desperate energy that once filled the streets has been erased so completely that it feels as though it never existed at all. Pompeii does not fall into silence. It is forced into it. The ash continues to settle, drifting down slowly now, no longer urgent, no longer violent. It lands softly on rooftops that no longer hold, on streets that no longer lead anywhere, on bodies that no longer move. Everything is covered, everything is still. Where there were once footsteps, there are only impressions. Where there were once voices, there is only the absence of them. The city remains in place. Walls, doorways, courtyards, but stripped of the one thing that gave it meaning, life. Inside what used to be a home, a figure lies where it fell, one arm slightly raised, as if reaching for something just out of reach. Nearby, another rests curled inward, preserving the final instinct to protect, to endure, to survive. None of it was enough. Across the city, the same scenes repeat. Moments interrupted, actions unfinished, lives halted mid-motion. There is no pattern to who remains where, no logic to who fell first or who lasted longer. Only endings. Above it all, the sky is no longer visible. It has been replaced entirely by the lingering presence of ash, thick and unmoving, sealing the city beneath it like a final, irreversible decision. And above that, silent once more, stands Mount Vesuvius, calm again, as if nothing has happened, as if the destruction below was simply a passing moment, already forgotten. Time, however, does not forget. It slows, then it stops. Layers of ash harden. The city is preserved, not intentionally, not mercifully, but completely. Every street, every room, every final position remains locked in place, untouched by change, untouched by decay. Pompeii does not disappear. It is buried, hidden from the world yet intact beneath it. Centuries will pass before it is seen again, before the silence is broken, before the final moments of these lives are uncovered, studied, and quietly contemplated by those who come long after. And when they are, one truth will remain unavoidable. This was not a distant tragedy, not an abstract event. It was a day, a single day, lived hour by hour, breath by breath, until there were no hours left to live. In ancient Egypt, hair was less a personal feature and more a persistent inconvenience. It grew when it wasn't wanted, trapped heat like a poorly designed roof, and had an unfortunate tendency to attract things that no one, in any century, has ever been pleased to host. So the Egyptians, being practical people when it suited them, made a bold decision. They removed it, completely. Shaved heads were not a sign of punishment or rebellion. They were normal. Men shaved, women shaved, children were often shaved, with the occasional symbolic lock left behind like a small compromise with tradition. In a land where the sun was relentless and hygiene was a daily negotiation, having no hair was simply efficient. It reduced heat. It reduced parasites. It reduced the general chaos of trying to maintain something that clearly had no respect for the climate it lived in. And yet, despite this widespread war against natural hair, the Egyptians were oddly obsessed with hairstyles. This is where logic quietly steps aside, because while their real hair was removed, artificial hair became a masterpiece. Wigs were not an afterthought, they were a statement, crafted from human hair, plant fibers, or a combination of both. They were styled, layered, braided, and shaped with a level of care that suggests the Egyptians did not hate hair at all. They simply preferred to control it. A wig did not grow unpredictably. It did not rebel. It did exactly what it was designed to do, and nothing more. It could be taken off when inconvenient, adjusted when necessary, and replaced entirely if fashion demanded it. In short, it was everything natural hair refused to be. Status quickly found its way into this system. The more elaborate the wig, the more it said about the person wearing it. Thick curls, tight braids, carefully arranged layers, these were not random choices. They were signals, wealth, rank, identity, all displayed without a single word being spoken. Even the gods, as depicted in Egyptian art, rarely appeared with anything resembling natural hair. They too wore perfection. So the Egyptians did not reject hair, they rejected its unpredictability. And in doing so, they turned something ordinary into something entirely controlled, deliberate, and unmistakably powerful. Because in ancient Egypt, even your hair, or lack of it, was part of the performance. Once the Egyptians removed their natural hair, they did something quietly ironic. They replaced it with better hair. Not slightly better, not improved. Completely superior in every possible way. Thicker, darker, more symmetrical, and most importantly, obedient. Because if there is one thing natural hair refuses to be, it is obedient. Wigs solved that problem immediately. These were not simple coverings thrown on out of necessity. Egyptian wigs were engineered, crafted with intention, shaped with precision, and styled to communicate far more than appearance. They were, in essence, wearable identity. The materials alone tell you everything. The wealthy used real human hair, carefully collected and woven into dense, layered structures that could rival anything seen in modern fashion. The less wealthy relied on plant fibers or wool, achieving similar shapes with slightly less elegance, but still making the same point. Everyone in some form participated. Design mattered a lot. Short wigs, close to the scalp, offered practicality and a certain understated confidence. Longer wigs, flowing over the shoulders, suggested status, leisure, and the kind of life where you did not need to worry about sweating through your hairstyle while working in the fields. Then there were the elaborate designs, braided, curled, sometimes tiered in layers, that seemed less like hair and more like architecture. And like all architecture, they required maintenance. Wigs were cleaned, oiled, perfumed, and stored carefully when not in use. Because while natural hair might tolerate neglect, a wig had standards. Let it deteriorate, and suddenly your carefully constructed image collapses into something far less impressive. There is also the small detail that wigs could be changed, which meant identity could be adjusted at will. A different wig for a different occasion, a more formal style for ceremonies, a simpler one for daily life. In a society deeply invested in presentation, this flexibility was not just convenient, it was essential. You were not locked into one version of yourself. You could present the version that best fit the moment. Even children and servants wore wigs, though often simpler ones. The idea was not exclusivity, but participation. Everyone existed within this system of controlled appearance, just at different levels of refinement. So, while it might seem deceptive, replacing real hair with something artificial, the Egyptians saw it differently. This was not deception, this was improvement. Because why accept what grows naturally when you can wear something that looks exactly the way you want? And in a world built on order, symbolism, and control, that question answers itself. Once the wig was perfectly placed, structured, balanced, and radiating the quiet confidence of something that would never misbehave, the Egyptians added the final touch, scent. Because looking impressive was only half the job. In a climate where heat did not politely step aside, smelling acceptable, preferably pleasant, was a daily challenge. And the Egyptians, never ones to do things halfway, approached this problem with remarkable creativity. enter the scented cone. At first glance, it appears almost absurd. A small, wax-like cone placed carefully on top of the wig, or directly on the head, sitting there as if it has every intention of staying exactly where it is, which, technically, it does, at least for a while. But the sun has other plans. As the day progresses and the heat builds, the cone begins to soften. Slowly, deliberately, it melts, releasing oils and perfumes that seep down into the wig and hair beneath. The effect is gradual, almost theatrical, a steady diffusion of fragrance, ensuring that the wearer carries a controlled aura of pleasant scent rather than the less desirable alternative. It is, in essence, a time-released perfume system, subtle, efficient, and just slightly inconvenient. Because while the idea is elegant, the execution requires a certain tolerance. Imagine standing in the Egyptian heat, perfectly dressed, carefully composed, while something on your head is slowly liquefying, dripping, not excessively, but enough to remind you that beauty, as always, comes with its conditions. And yet, this was desirable. Perfume in ancient Egypt was not a luxury, it was a necessity. Oils protected the skin from dryness, masked the less appealing aspects of daily life, and carried social meaning. The type of scent, the quality of the oils, even the ingredients used, all of it communicated something about the person wearing them. The wealthy had access to the finest blends, frankincense, myrrh, lotus extracts, complex layered fragrances that lingered long after they left a room. Others made do with simpler oils, achieving the same purpose if not the same refinement. But the goal remained the same: control. Control over how one appeared, control over how one was perceived, even control over how one smelled hour by hour as the sun did its relentless work. Because in ancient Egypt, presentation was never static. It evolved throughout the day, sometimes quite literally, melting into place. By now, it should be clear that in ancient Egypt, hair, real or otherwise, was never just about appearance. It was a language, a quiet, carefully constructed system, where every strand, every curl, every layer said something about who you were and where you stood. And like all good systems, it was deeply concerned with status. Not everyone wore the same wig. That would have been far too egalitarian, and ancient societies rarely indulge in that kind of simplicity. Instead, hairstyles became markers, clear, visible signals of wealth, rank, and importance. At the lower end, wigs were functional. Simpler designs, fewer layers, less volume. Still shaped, still intentional, but lacking the complexity that required time, resources, and skilled hands. These were the wigs of workers, servants, and those who had more pressing concerns than achieving perfect symmetry on their heads. Then came the middle ground. Individuals with some means, some standing, began to incorporate more detail. Braids appeared, curls were defined, the structure became more deliberate. These wigs did not scream wealth, but they certainly suggested it. The message was subtle, not powerful perhaps, but not insignificant either. And then, at the top, everything changed. The elite did not wear wigs. They wore statements, thick, layered constructions that framed the face and extended over the shoulders, often divided into sections, braided with precision, or styled into controlled waves. These were not quick creations. They required craftsmanship, maintenance, and a level of attention that bordered on obsession. The result was unmistakable. Power made visible. Royal figures took this even further. The wigs associated with rulers and high officials were not just elaborate, they were symbolic. Shapes became more defined, styles more rigid, sometimes paired with headdresses that added height, presence, and authority. A ruler did not simply enter a room. They arrived, visually declaring their position before a single word was spoken. Even children were not exempt from this system. The famous side-lock hairstyle, one section of hair left unshaved while the rest of the head remained smooth, marked youth and status in a way that was instantly recognizable. Nothing was accidental. Every choice, every detail, every carefully arranged strand contributed to a larger message. In a society built on hierarchy and order, appearance reinforced reality. You were what you wore. And in ancient Egypt, what you wore on your head might have been the most important part of all. If adults in ancient Egypt used wigs to declare status, control appearance, and quietly dominate social situations without speaking, children were given something much simpler, a single lock of hair. Known today as the side lock of youth, this hairstyle was exactly what it sounds like. A shaved head with one carefully preserved strand, usually hanging from the side. Minimal effort, maximum symbolism. It told everyone exactly what they needed to know. This is a child. Treat accordingly. The rest of the head remained shaved, maintaining all the practical benefits Egyptians clearly valued: cooling, hygiene, and the general absence of things crawling where they should not be. But that one lock stayed, often braided or shaped, deliberately maintained rather than forgotten, because nothing in ancient Egypt was ever accidental. The side lock was not just about age, it was about identity and transition. A visual marker that this person was not yet fully part of the adult world, but on their way toward it. Still protected, still dependent, still existing in a space where expectations were different. And like everything else, it had meaning beyond the obvious. In religious imagery, the child god Horus is often depicted with this same side lock, reinforcing its symbolism: youth, vulnerability, potential. All wrapped into a single, slightly impractical strand of hair. When even the gods follow your hairstyle, you can assume it carries some weight. As children grew, the lock remained until a certain age or stage of life. Then eventually, it disappeared. Removed. Like everything else that marked childhood, as the individual stepped into adult roles and expectations. And that transition mattered, because once the lock was gone, the choices became more complicated. Shaving, wigs, oils, status. Everything that defined adult identity now applied. There was no more simplicity, no more single strand explaining who you were. You had to construct it yourself, which, in a society as detail-obsessed as ancient Egypt, was both an opportunity and a responsibility. So while the side lock may seem small, even insignificant compared to the elaborate wigs of the elite, it served a crucial purpose. It marked the beginning. A quiet, unmistakable signal that one day, this child would step into a world where even their hair, or lack of it, would become part of a much larger performance. If wigs represented control, and status shaped every strand, then the priests of ancient Egypt chose something far more extreme. They chose nothing at all. Complete baldness was not just a practical decision for them, it was a requirement. While others shaved for comfort or convenience, priests shaved for purity. And not occasionally, constantly, heads, bodies, faces, everything was stripped of hair with a level of commitment that suggests they had very little patience for regrowth. Because in their world, hair was not just inconvenient, it was impure. Temples were not ordinary spaces. They were places where the divine was believed to exist in close proximity, where rituals were performed daily, and where even the smallest detail could carry meaning. Entering such a space required preparation, and that preparation began with the body itself. Hair, being natural, unpredictable, and prone to collecting dust, oil, and the occasional insect, did not meet the standard, so it was removed. Regularly, priests would shave themselves multiple times over short periods, ensuring that no trace remained. It was not a one-time act, but an ongoing discipline. A routine that demanded attention, precision, and, one imagines, a certain tolerance for inconvenience. But the result was clear, a body that reflected order, a surface free of anything uncontrolled. In contrast to the elaborate wigs worn by the elite, priests presented themselves in a way that was almost severe. No decoration, no artificial enhancement, just clean lines and deliberate simplicity. It was not about looking impressive, it was about being acceptable to the gods. And even beyond shaving, their routines extended into constant washing, the use of oils, and strict personal maintenance. Purity was not achieved once. It was maintained repeatedly with effort. This created an interesting divide within Egyptian society. On one side, individuals used wigs, oils, and styling to build identity, display status, and shape perception. On the other, priests removed all of it, stripping themselves down to something more controlled, more disciplined, and arguably more extreme. Both approaches were about control, just applied in different directions. One added layers, the other removed them entirely, And in a culture where appearance was never accidental, even the absence of hair carried meaning, because sometimes saying nothing at all says everything. If the living cared about their appearance, and they clearly did, the dead cared even more. Or rather, the living cared on their behalf, which is arguably worse, because now you have no say in the final version of yourself that will be preserved for eternity. In ancient Egypt, death did not simplify anything. It complicated it, because now your appearance was no longer temporary, it was permanent. And permanence demands perfection. When a person died, their body underwent careful preparation, cleaning, wrapping, preservation. But alongside all of this, appearance remained a priority. Hair, once again, became part of the process, or more accurately, the illusion of hair. Wigs were often included with mummies, either placed on the head or prepared as part of the burial equipment. Not casual wigs, not everyday wear, but carefully chosen pieces meant to present the deceased in the best possible way. Because wherever they were going, they would need to look appropriate. The afterlife in Egyptian belief was not abstract. It was structured, ordered. A continuation of existence where identity still mattered. And identity, as we have already established, was deeply tied to appearance. Arriving poorly styled was not an option, so wigs were selected with the same attention given in life, perhaps even more. Thick, well-formed, balanced, and idealized. Not necessarily realistic, but perfect. Because this was not about accuracy. It was about representation. Who you were, or who you were meant to be remembered as. Even figures like Osiris, often depicted with carefully arranged hair or headdresses, reinforced the idea that appearance continued beyond death. The divine world did not abandon structure. It perfected it. For the wealthy, this meant elaborate wigs and detailed preparation. For others, simpler versions served the same purpose. The principle remained unchanged. The dead must be complete. Hair, or the absence of it, was not left to chance. Because in death, there were no second opportunities. No adjustments, no changes, no quiet improvements over time. What you were given was what you kept, forever. So while the living adjusted their wigs daily, refining, correcting, adapting, the dead were fixed, presented in a final, unchanging form. A version of themselves that would endure, carefully constructed, deliberately styled, and, like everything else in ancient Egypt, entirely intentional. By this point, it should be clear that hair in ancient Egypt was never just decoration, it was strategy. A carefully managed tool used to influence perception, reinforce identity, and, when necessary, quietly manipulate those around you. Because appearance, in a society built on order and symbolism, was never neutral. It always meant something. For women, especially among the elite, hairstyles and wigs became instruments of presence. Long, flowing wigs with layered curls framed the face, softened features, and created a sense of controlled elegance. Braids added structure, precision, a kind of visual rhythm that suggested both care and intention. Nothing was accidental, even the way a wig moved. How it rested on the shoulders, how it shifted with each step, was part of the effect. It created an impression, and impressions, in a world where power often depended on perception, mattered more than most things. For men, the message was different, but no less deliberate. Wigs could signal authority, stability, control. A well-constructed style suggested discipline, order, the kind of person who understood their place, and expected others to understand it too. And then there were the rulers. Figures like Cleopatra, whose image has been shaped as much by myth as by history, are often associated with distinct iconic hairstyles. Whether entirely accurate or not, the association itself tells you something important. Hair became part of the legend, a visual shorthand for identity, power, and presence. Because when people remember you, they rarely remember everything. They remember what stands out, and in ancient Egypt, hair, real or artificial, was designed to stand out. Even beyond status and attraction, there was control. Wigs could be adjusted, replaced, perfected. Unlike natural hair, which grew unevenly and refused to behave, wigs offered consistency. The ability to present the same image day after day without variation. In a culture that valued order above chaos, this was not just convenient. It was ideal. So hair became something more than personal style. It became language, a way to communicate without speaking, to assert without explaining, to influence without appearing to try. And like all powerful tools, it was used carefully, because in ancient Egypt, even the smallest detail could shape how you were seen, and how you were seen could shape everything. At the end of the day, after the heat has softened the scented cones, after the oils have done their quiet work, after the carefully arranged curls have held their shape through sun and movement, there comes a moment that is rarely depicted. The wig comes off, and with it, something else slips away. Because while wigs in ancient Egypt were tools of control, identity, and carefully managed perfection, they were also, in a sense, a performance, a constructed version of the self, worn outward for others to see, interpret, and respond to. Removing it is not dramatic. There is no audience, just a quieter version of the person who wore it. Beneath the wig, the reality returns. A shaved scalp, smooth and practical, free from ornament. No curls, no braids, no layered statements of status. Just skin, unadorned and unambiguous. And in that moment, the contrast becomes clear. The public self, shaped and displayed. The private self, simplified and functional. This duality is not accidental. It reflects something deeper within Egyptian life. The constant balance between order and reality, between what is presented and what is lived. In temples, in art, in daily routines, everything is structured, deliberate, composed. But beneath that structure, there is always something more basic, more human. The wig, then, is not deception. It is translation, a way of taking the unpredictable, the imperfect, the natural, and reshaping it into something controlled, meaningful, and visible to others. A way of turning identity into something that can be seen, understood, and remembered. And yet it is temporary. Each day it is put on. Each day it is removed. A cycle that mirrors much of Egyptian life itself. Rituals repeated, appearances maintained, order constantly rebuilt against the quiet persistence of change. Because despite all their efforts to control, define, and perfect, the Egyptians understood something fundamental. Nothing remains fixed forever. Not the body, not the image, not even the carefully constructed versions of ourselves that we present to the world, but for a time, under the sun, beneath the weight of a perfectly crafted wig, surrounded by scent and structure, they could come remarkably close, and sometimes that was enough. In the Celtic world, a wedding was not a quiet promise whispered between two people under a soft sky. It was a negotiation, not the romantic kind either, the kind where two families sit, watch, measure, and quietly calculate what this union will mean long after the ceremony ends. Because while the couple stands at the centre, they are never alone. Behind them stand entire clans, carrying histories, grudges, alliances, and expectations that stretch far beyond personal affection. Marriage here is not just about love, it is about stability. Land might change hands, livestock might be exchanged, agreements might be made that affect not just two lives, but dozens, sometimes hundreds. A wedding could strengthen alliances, end disputes, or, if handled poorly, create entirely new ones. So naturally everyone pays attention. The process often begins long before the ceremony itself. Families discuss terms, sometimes formally, sometimes through a series of casual conversations that are anything but casual. What will be given? What will be received? What protections are in place if the marriage fails? Because the Celts, practical as ever, do not assume everything will go perfectly. They plan for the opposite. Dowries or bride prices are arranged. Gifts are exchanged. Not symbolic trinkets, but meaningful assets. Things that represent value, commitment, and more importantly, consequence. This is not a gesture. It is a contract. Just without the paperwork modern societies seem so fond of. And yet, despite all of this structure, something more human remains. The couple themselves are not irrelevant. Their compatibility matters, but not in the soft romantic sense of shared dreams and long walks through fields. It matters in a practical way. Can they live together? Can they maintain the household? Can they produce heirs, manage responsibilities, and represent their families without causing unnecessary problems? Because that is the real expectation, not perfection. Function. So when the day of the wedding finally arrives, What unfolds is not just a celebration, it is the visible confirmation of an agreement. A moment where two individuals step forward, yes, but more importantly, where two clans bind themselves together with all the weight, opportunity, and quiet tension that such a bond inevitably brings. And once that bond is made, there is no pretending it was ever simple. Once the agreement is settled, terms discussed, expectations quietly locked into place, the next phase begins. People arrive, and not just a few close relatives carrying polite smiles. Entire groups begin to gather, moving across hills, forests, and rough paths, bringing with them not only gifts and provisions, but presents. Because in a Celtic wedding, showing up is not optional, it is a statement. Who attends matters. Who does not attend matters even more. Families arrive in clusters, often dressed in their best garments, not necessarily for vanity, but for representation. You do not just appear as yourself, you appear as part of something larger. Your clan's strength, wealth, and cohesion are quietly displayed through numbers, behavior, and the subtle art of looking like you belong exactly where you stand. The location itself is rarely random. Ceremonies often take place outdoors, near natural landmarks, groves, rivers, open fields, or ancient stones that have stood long enough to make human agreements feel temporary by comparison. These spaces are not chosen for beauty alone, they carry meaning. Nature, in Celtic belief, is not a backdrop. It is a participant. The land witnesses the union, the sky watches, and the elements, earth, air, fire, water, are present whether acknowledged directly or not. It adds a layer of seriousness that no enclosed hall could quite replicate. As the crowd gathers, the atmosphere becomes something layered. There is excitement, certainly. Weddings are among the few occasions where large groups come together without the immediate expectation of conflict. But beneath that, there is observation. People watch each other. Old rivalries may be set aside for the day, or at least politely ignored. New alliances are noted. Conversations happen in quiet corners. Words exchanged that have little to do with the couple and everything to do with the shifting landscape of relationships. Meanwhile, preparations continue. Food is arranged. Fires are built. Space is cleared for the ceremony itself. Everything moves with a sense of purpose, even if no one is giving direct orders. Tradition guides the process more than any single individual. And at the center of it all, the couple waits. Not isolated, but not entirely part of the crowd either. They stand between two worlds, their separate pasts, and the shared future that is about to be declared in front of everyone present. Because once the ceremony begins, this gathering will transform from observation into witness. As the gathering settles, conversations quieting, movements slowing, the focus shifts toward the center. Not a grand structure, not a decorated hall, but something far older in meaning. A space is marked, sometimes with stones, sometimes with simple boundaries drawn by those who know the ritual. It does not need to be elaborate. It needs to be understood. This is where the ordinary ends and something more deliberate begins. At the heart of this space, a fire is prepared. Not for warmth, though it provides that. Not for cooking, though it could serve that purpose later. This fire exists for something else entirely. It is a witness, a symbol, a constant presence that transforms the ceremony from agreement into something binding. Because in Celtic belief, fire is not passive. It sees. It carries meaning between worlds, the visible and the unseen. To stand beside it is to place your words, your promises, and your intentions in full view of something that cannot be easily ignored or deceived. The flames are lit, slowly at first, then stronger, steady, controlled. Not a raging blaze, but something contained, purposeful, enough to be felt, enough to be seen. Its light flickers across the faces of those gathered, casting movement where there was stillness, reminding everyone present that this moment is not static, it is alive. The couple is brought forward. They stand beside the fire, close enough to feel its heat, far enough to remain composed. This is no longer about them as individuals, it is about what they represent. Two lines, two histories, now positioned together in a place where separation no longer defines them. Around them, the crowd forms a quiet boundary. No longer observers in the casual sense, but witnesses. Each person present now holds a role, whether spoken or not. They see, they remember. And by being there, they validate what is about to happen. The fire continues to burn, unimpressed by human emotion, indifferent to hesitation. It does not pause. It does not wait. It simply exists, steady and certain, as if to remind everyone that whatever is spoken here will stand against something far more enduring than individual desire. And in that presence, the ceremony begins to take shape. Words will soon be spoken, promises made. But first, the couple must stand still, side by side, in the glow of something that has no interest in compromise. Because once the fire witnesses it, there is no pretending it did not happen. With the fire steady and the gathering now silent in the way only a fully attentive crowd can be, the ceremony moves to its most recognizable moment, the binding. This is where the phrase, tying the knot, stops being a metaphor and becomes something far more literal. The couple steps closer together, their hands brought forward, usually the right hands, though traditions vary slightly depending on region and interpretation. And then, a cord is introduced. Not just any cord. It may be a braided rope, a woven cloth, or a strip of fabric prepared specifically for this moment. Sometimes simple, sometimes decorated, but always intentional. Because this is not decoration. This is the act. The officiant, often a druid or elder, someone trusted to understand both the ritual and its meaning, wraps the cord around the couple's hands, slowly, deliberately, each loop placed with care, as if rushing would somehow weaken what is being created. The hands are bound together, not tightly enough to cause discomfort, but firmly enough to be felt. A physical reminder that what is happening here is not abstract. This is not just spoken, it is enacted. And as the cord settles into place, something shifts. The two individuals who stood beside each other only moments ago are now connected, not symbolically in the vague sense, but visibly, undeniably. Anyone watching can see it. Anyone present can remember it. This is the point where the ceremony becomes real. Words may follow, vows may be spoken, but this moment, the binding, is what defines the union. It represents not just connection, but obligation, a joining that carries weight beyond emotion. Because in Celtic tradition, handfasting was not always permanent in the modern sense. Some unions were formed for a set period, a year and a day, after which the couple could choose to continue or part ways. A practical approach, one might argue, allowing for compatibility to be tested before committing indefinitely. But whether temporary or lifelong, the meaning remained the same. You are bound. Your actions affect each other. Your choices are no longer entirely your own. And as the cord holds their hands together, the couple stands in front of their clans, the fire and the land itself, quietly acknowledging that what has been tied here is not easily undone. Because once bound, even briefly, nothing returns to what it was before. With hands bound and the fire steady beside them, the ceremony reaches its most dangerous moment, the speaking. Because silence up to this point has been safe. Actions can be observed, interpreted, even slightly misunderstood if necessary. But words, once spoken, have a habit of staying exactly where they were placed, refusing to be adjusted later, when reality proves less cooperative. The couple now faces each other, bound together, close enough to feel the tension of the cord, aware of every eye watching, every ear listening. This is no private exchange. There is no room for vague promises or poetic exaggeration that sounds good in the moment, but dissolves later. What is said here matters. Vows in a Celtic wedding are not standardized lines repeated without thought. They vary, sometimes simple, sometimes deeply personal, but always rooted in the same idea. Commitment expressed in terms that can be understood by everyone present. Promises are made to support, to protect, to remain loyal, not in the abstract but in practical ways, to share burdens, to maintain the household, to stand together in times that will almost certainly test whatever confidence they feel now. Because unlike modern ceremonies that occasionally lean toward optimism, Celtic traditions carry a quieter realism. Life will not be easy, so the vows reflect that. There is often an acknowledgement of uncertainty, of seasons changing, of fortunes rising and falling. The promises are not about perfection, they are about endurance, about remaining bound, not just when it is convenient, but when it is difficult. And as each word is spoken, it is witnessed. not just by the officiant, but by the entire gathering. Family members, allies, even those who arrived out of obligation rather than affection. They all hear it. And once heard, those words become part of something larger, a shared memory, a record that exists without writing. Because in a society where agreements are often reinforced through reputation rather than documentation, what is spoken publicly carries weight. Forgetting a vow is one thing. Being reminded of it by an entire community is something else entirely. The fire continues to burn beside them, indifferent but present. The cord remains tied, and with each promise spoken, the binding deepens. Not physically, but in a way that is far more difficult to undo. Because once words are released into the air, especially in a moment like this, they do not disappear. They remain, and they expect to be honoured. With the vows spoken, carefully, publicly, and now permanently lodged in the memory of everyone present, the ceremony shifts from words to something far less poetic. Assets. Because while promises are meaningful, they are also, from a Celtic perspective, incomplete without reinforcement. A union may be blessed by fire and witnessed by clans, but it is secured through exchange. Gifts are brought forward. Not casual offerings, not symbolic trinkets meant to be admired briefly and forgotten. These are deliberate, practical contributions. Items that carry value, purpose, and consequence. Livestock, land rights, crafted goods, weapons, textiles. Each piece represents more than generosity. It represents commitment. Often, one family provides a bride price, while the other contributes a dowry. The terms vary depending on region, status, and prior agreement, but the logic remains consistent. Both sides invest, both sides risk, and both sides gain something tangible from the union. This is not transactional in a cold sense. It is stabilizing, because a marriage without shared investment is fragile, but a marriage reinforced with resources, things that can be counted, used, and, if necessary, reclaimed, becomes something far more durable. If the union fails, there are consequences. If it succeeds, there is growth. Everything is accounted for, and importantly, everything is witnessed. Nothing is handed over in secret. The exchange happens in front of the gathered clans, ensuring that there is no confusion later. Who gave what? Who received what? And under what conditions? It is all observed, remembered, and, if necessary, enforced through social pressure rather than written contract, which, historically speaking, can be far more effective. The couple stands at the centre of this, still bound, still positioned between two groups who are now, quite literally, investing in their future. What they receive is not just wealth, it is expectation, to manage it, to grow it, to justify it. Because once resources are tied to a union, that union carries weight beyond emotion. It becomes something that others depend on, something that reflects not just personal success, but the strength of the agreement itself. And as the final items are exchanged, the message becomes clear. This marriage is no longer just spoken, it is anchored, bound not only by vows and ritual, but by the very real, very tangible reality of shared value. And that kind of bond is not easily ignored. With gifts exchanged and the union now anchored in more than sentiment, the ceremony turns to something older, quieter, and far less negotiable. The blessing. Because in a Celtic worldview, a marriage witnessed only by people is incomplete. Humans forget. They argue. They reinterpret events in ways that are convenient rather than accurate. If you want something to endure, you involve forces that are less flexible. So the couple, still bound, still standing beside the fire, becomes the focus once again, not as negotiators, not as recipients, but as participants in something beyond their control. The officiant steps forward, often a druid or an elder deeply familiar with tradition. They speak not to the crowd, but outward, to the land, the sky, the unseen presence that is believed to exist just beyond what can be touched. Their words are not casual. They are structured, deliberate, carrying the weight of repetition across generations. They call upon the elements, earth for stability, air for breath and change, fire already present for transformation and witness, water for flow and continuity. Each is acknowledged, invited, not as decoration but as participants in the union, because in Celtic belief these forces are not passive. They shape life, influence outcomes, and, if ignored, tend to make their displeasure known in ways that are difficult to ignore. The couple may be guided to touch the ground, to face the fire, to turn toward the wind, or to acknowledge water nearby. Each action reinforces the same idea. This marriage is not isolated. It exists within a larger system, and that system is now aware of it. Around them, the gathered clans remain silent, but their role has shifted once again. No longer observers or negotiators, they become witnesses in a deeper sense. They are not just remembering what happened, they are validating that it has been seen, heard, and accepted not only by people, but by the world itself. And in a culture where land and lineage are intertwined, that matters. Because a blessing is not just approval, it is expectation, a quiet understanding that what has been joined here should endure, should function, should align with the order of things rather than disrupt it. The fire continues to burn, steady as ever. The cord still binds. And as the final words of the blessing settle into the air, the ceremony reaches a point where nothing more needs to be proven. The union has been seen. By clans, by land, by something greater than both. And that, in this world, is as binding as anything can be. With the blessing spoken and the unseen forces politely acknowledged, the ceremony reaches its most anticipated phase. The part everyone has been quietly waiting for, the feast. Because while vows bind and rituals sanctify, nothing reveals the true strength of a union quite like a room, or more accurately, an open field, full of well-fed, slightly intoxicated relatives who suddenly remember every opinion they have ever had. Food is brought out in abundance. Meat, bread, ale, whatever the region provides, all prepared in quantities that suggest moderation is not part of the plan. This is not a small gathering politely sharing a meal. This is a display of generosity, of wealth, of the ability to provide. Because feeding people is not just kindness, it is proof that the union is supported, that resources exist, that the couple, and more importantly, their families, are capable of sustaining what has just been created. A poor feast would raise questions. A strong one answers them before they are asked. And as the eating begins, so does the real interaction. People talk, not the careful, measured conversations of earlier, but something looser, more honest. Stories are told. Some about the couple, others about entirely unrelated events that somehow become relevant after enough ale. Laughter grows louder, restraint fades, and the boundaries between clans begin to soften, or occasionally sharpen. Because gatherings like this do not just strengthen alliances, they test them. Old tensions may resurface, disguised as jokes or casual remarks. Rivalries might briefly reappear, only to be smoothed over, or not, depending on how the evening unfolds. The success of the feast is not measured only by the quality of the food, but by the absence of conflict, or at least the successful containment of it. Meanwhile, the couple moves through this environment carefully, no longer at the center in the ceremonial sense, but still very much observed. How they interact, how they carry themselves, how they respond to both praise and subtle pressure, all of it is noted. Because this is their first test, not of love, but of function. Can they exist within this network of relationships without disrupting it? Can they hold their place? As the fire burns lower and the voices grow louder, the answer begins to take shape. Not in words, but in behavior. And by the end of the night, everyone present will have formed an opinion. Whether they share it is another matter entirely. As the feast begins to fade, voices lowering, fires settling into embers, and the last cups of ale passed with less enthusiasm than before, the ceremony reaches its quiet conclusion, not with a grand announcement, but with a departure, because at some point the couple must leave. Up until now, they have stood between worlds, between their past families and their shared future, between individual identity and something newly formed. But that balance cannot last. The ritual, the vows, the exchanges, all of it has led to this final step, separation from what came before. The couple prepares to go, not in isolation but with awareness. Every movement is still watched, though now less intensely. The crowd, tired but attentive, observes the transition. This is no longer performance. It is reality beginning. Depending on custom, The couple may leave together to a new household, or one partner may be formally brought into the home of the other's clan. Either way, the meaning is the same. They do not return unchanged, because what has been created cannot be undone by simply walking away. The cord that once bound their hands is removed, but its absence does not erase its effect. If anything, it makes it clearer. They are no longer physically tied, but the expectation remains. The memory remains. The agreement remains, and so does the weight of it. Behind them, the clans begin to disperse. Conversations end. Alliances settle into their new shapes, and life resumes its usual rhythm. Slightly altered, subtly shifted. What was once two separate paths has now become one, and that change extends outward, touching everyone connected to it. Quietly, inevitably, the fire, now reduced to glowing ash, still marks the place where it all happened. A reminder that something was witnessed here, not just by people, but by the land itself. And ahead of the couple lies something far less structured. Not ceremony, not ritual, but life. Unpredictable, demanding, and far less forgiving than the carefully controlled environment they have just left behind. The vows will be tested. The alliance will be measured. The expectations, spoken and unspoken, will need to be met. Because a Celtic wedding does not end with celebration. It begins with it. And everything that follows is where the real binding takes place. Death in the Viking world does not arrive quietly. It does not slip in unnoticed or allow for a graceful pause. It announces itself, loudly, inconveniently, and with a stubborn refusal to be ignored. One moment, a man is alive, boasting of raids and victories. The next, he is very much not, and everyone else is left with a long list of responsibilities. Because for the Norse, death is not the end. That would be far too simple and, frankly, far too boring. Instead, it is the beginning of a journey, one that requires preparation, attention to detail, and a surprising amount of logistics for someone who is no longer capable of contributing. The moment death occurs, the household shifts. Grief is present, yes, but it is not allowed to take control. There are tasks to be done, and delaying them would only make matters worse. The body must be handled quickly, not out of coldness, but necessity. Time, unlike the deceased, continues to move. Family members and close companions gather around the body. There is no dramatic silence, no poetic stillness. Instead, there is movement, purposeful, almost routine. Death is tragic, but it is not unfamiliar. Most have seen it before. Some, more often than they would prefer. The first act is cleansing. The body is washed carefully, removing dirt, blood, and the less dignified signs of death. This is not about vanity. It is about respect. The dead are being prepared for their final appearance, not just before the living, but before whatever waits beyond. And showing up unprepared is quite simply not acceptable. Then comes clothing. Not ordinary garments, but deliberate choices. A Viking is dressed as they would wish to be remembered, or perhaps as they would wish to be seen in the next world. Fine fabrics, armor, or simple but meaningful attire depending on status. Every detail sends a message. This is who they were, and this is who they remain. Weapons are often placed beside them. A sword, an axe, a shield. Not because anyone expects the dead to leap up and defend themselves, but because identity does not end with breath. A warrior without weapons is no warrior at all, even in death. And as this quiet transformation unfolds, the living begin to gather. Because this is not just an ending, it is the opening act of something far greater. Once the body is washed, dressed, and made presentable, arguably in better condition than during most of its living years, the focus shifts from appearance to preparation. Not emotional preparation, of course. Vikings are not particularly interested in sitting in circles discussing their feelings. This is logistical preparation, the kind that assumes the afterlife is less a mystery and more a destination with very specific entry requirements. The dead are arranged carefully. Position matters. A body might be laid out in a hall, placed on a raised platform, or temporarily housed while the more elaborate parts of the funeral are organized. And there will be elaborate parts. Vikings rarely did anything halfway, especially not something as important as death. Now begins the gathering of grave goods. This is where the line between practicality and belief becomes flexible. Objects are selected not randomly, but with intention. Weapons, tools, jewelry, drinking horns. Items that defined the person in life are chosen to accompany them into death. It is less about sentimentality and more about continuity. The assumption is simple. Wherever they are going, they will need their things. And so, a warrior receives weapons. A craftsman might receive tools. A wealthy individual? Well, they receive quite a lot of everything. Because apparently status does not expire with death. If anything, it becomes even more important. No one wants to arrive in the next world looking like they packed in a hurry. Food and drink are often included as well. Because nothing says safe journey quite like sending someone off with enough supplies to survive a small expedition. Meat, bread, ale. Provisions for a road that no one has actually mapped, but everyone insists exists. Then there are the animals. Horses are the most common, valued for their speed and strength. A warrior might need one after all. Dogs may also be included, companions in life and apparently in death. These animals are sacrificed and placed with the deceased, a practice that feels less comforting when you consider it from the animal's perspective. All of this serves a single purpose: to ensure that the dead do not arrive unprepared, unwanted, or worse, forgotten. Because in the Viking mind, the afterlife is not a vague reward, it is a continuation, and no one shows up to a continuation empty-handed. By the time the body is prepared and the grave goods begin to pile up into what looks suspiciously like a well-organized travel kit for the dead, the living have started to arrive in earnest. News of death travels quickly in a Viking community, partly out of respect, partly because no one wants to be the person who missed a funeral that everyone else attended. People come from nearby farms, neighbouring settlements, and occasionally from far beyond, depending on who the deceased was. A well-known warrior or chieftain can attract a crowd that feels less like a mourning assembly and more like a regional event. And in many ways it is exactly that. Because a Viking funeral is not just about honouring the dead, it is about reminding the living who mattered. As people gather, the atmosphere becomes a strange mixture of grief, curiosity, and social awareness. There are genuine tears, of course. Family members, close companions, those who shared real bonds with the deceased. But alongside them stand others who are observing, evaluating, quietly noting who has come, who has not, and what this all says about alliances and reputation. This is not cold-heartedness. It is reality. In a world where survival depends on relationships, even death becomes part of the social fabric. Conversations begin. Stories are told. Some are respectful, others slightly exaggerated. A minor skirmish becomes a heroic battle. A decent hunter becomes legendary. The dead, conveniently unable to correct the record, begin their transformation into something larger than life. Memory, after all, is flexible, and funerals are excellent places to reshape it. Meanwhile, preparations continue around them. Wood is gathered. A ship may be prepared if the deceased is important enough, or if the family is determined to make them important in death, regardless of their achievements in life. The scale of what is coming becomes increasingly clear. This will not be a quiet burial. This will be something that people remember. And as the crowd grows, so does the sense of expectation. There is an unspoken understanding among those present. This ceremony will reflect not only the life of the one who has died, but the strength, wealth, and pride of those who remain. Because in Viking society, even in death, reputation is everything. And this gathering is where that reputation is about to be displayed in full. Now comes the decision that separates an ordinary farewell from a story people will repeat for generations. How exactly the dead will leave. Burial is an option, of course, quiet, practical, and deeply uninteresting. But for those with status, ambition, or relatives with a flair for spectacle, there is a better choice. Fire. Or more precisely, a ship and then fire. Ideally both, because if you are going to send someone into the next world, you might as well make sure the gods notice. The ship, if one is used, is not merely a vessel. It is a statement. A declaration that the person being honoured was important enough to be given not just a grave, but a journey. The vessel is dragged onto land or positioned near water, depending on local custom and convenience. Either way, it becomes the centrepiece of everything that follows. The body is placed aboard with careful ceremony, not tossed in, not hurried. Positioned, arranged, almost staged. Around it go the grave goods gathered earlier. Tools, weapons, food, animals, personal items. By now, the scene resembles less a funeral and more a carefully curated exhibition of a life that has been neatly summarized in objects. If no ship is available, or if practicality wins over ambition, a funeral pyre is constructed instead. Wood is stacked high, often higher than strictly necessary, because subtlety is not a Viking strength. The goal is not just to burn the body, the goal is to transform it, to send it upward in smoke, to carry it away in fire, to make the departure visible. And visibility matters, because this is not a private moment. The gathered crowd watches as everything is assembled. They observe the scale, the detail, the effort. Every piece of wood, every object placed beside the dead, speaks to the same idea. This person mattered, and we are willing to prove it. There is tension now, quiet but unmistakable. The ceremony is nearing its peak. The preparations, the gathering, the careful arrangements, they have all led to this moment. Soon, the fire will be lit, and when it is, there will be no undoing it. Just before the fire is lit, before everything turns from carefully arranged order into irreversible ash, there is a pause. Not a long one, not overly sentimental, but enough to allow the final rituals to unfold. Because even the Vikings, who are not known for their patience, understand that some moments demand a certain ceremony. At the center of this stage is the ritual specialist, often a woman, sometimes referred to as a seeress or priestess. She steps forward with a presence that quietly silences the crowd. This is not her first funeral. If anything, she moves with the calm confidence of someone who has done this often enough to know exactly how the process works. And perhaps more unsettlingly, believes in it completely. She begins her work. Chants, invocations, spoken words directed not at the living but at the unseen. The gods are called upon, spirits are acknowledged. The path between worlds, whatever shape it takes, is addressed with a seriousness that leaves little room for doubt. This is not symbolic. To those present, this is functional, necessary, like opening a door that does not respond well to being ignored. Meanwhile, the body remains at the center of attention, surrounded by its collected life. And in some cases, that collection become more complicated. Historical accounts, particularly those written by the ever-observant outsider Ahmad ibn Fadlan, describe moments that are far less serene than one might expect. In certain high-status funerals, a human sacrifice may be included. A servant or slave, chosen or volunteered, is prepared to accompany the deceased into the afterlife. The logic is brutally straightforward. A powerful person should not travel alone. The process is ritualized, controlled, and deeply unsettling. The individual is honored, sometimes intoxicated, and ultimately killed as part of the ceremony, not hidden, not softened. This is a public act, witnessed and accepted as part of the larger belief system. Back among the living, cups are raised. Not in celebration exactly, but not entirely in sorrow either. Toasts are made to the dead. Words of remembrance, of respect, of carefully curated legacy. Stories resurface again, growing slightly more heroic with each telling. Everything builds toward a single point. The fire has not yet been lit, but the world already feels different. The boundary between living and dead has thinned, stretched by ritual, belief and expectation. And standing at the edge of that boundary, everyone knows what comes next. The moment that turns farewell into finality. At last the waiting ends. After the chants, the offerings, the careful arrangement of everything that once defined a life, there comes a moment when nothing more can be prepared, adjusted, or improved. The ritual has reached its edge. All that remains is the act that gives it meaning. The fire must be lit. There is no universal rule for who performs this task, but it is never random. A close relative, a respected figure, or someone chosen for symbolic reasons steps forward. This is not a casual gesture. It is deliberate, watched by every pair of eyes gathered around. Whoever holds the flame is for a brief moment responsible for bridging two worlds. The torch is brought near. For a heartbeat, nothing happens. Then the wood catches. At first, it is unimpressive. A flicker, a small tongue of flame licking at the edges of carefully stacked timber. But patience has never been fire's weakness. It spreads quickly, hungrily, climbing through the dry wood, reaching the ship or pyre, wrapping itself around everything placed there. Soon, the quiet order of the funeral becomes something else entirely. Heat intensifies. Smoke rises thick and dark, carrying with it the scent of burning wood, cloth, and everything that was meant to accompany the dead. The flames grow louder, crackling and shifting, consuming the careful arrangement with ruthless efficiency. What was once deliberate and structured is now chaos, but purposeful chaos. The crowd watches. Some stand in silence. Others murmur prayers or speak softly to the dead, as if their words might still be heard over the growing roar. There are those who weep openly, and those who do not weep at all. Both responses are accepted. Both belong here. The fire does more than destroy. It transforms. To the Vikings, this is not simply the end of a body. It is a release. The flames are not an enemy, but a vehicle, lifting the essence of the person upward, sending them toward whatever fate awaits. Smoke rises into the sky, drifting beyond reach, carrying with it the final trace of the life that once was. There is no turning back now. The moment the fire takes hold, the boundary is crossed. The living remain behind, watching as the dead move on. No longer present, no longer reachable, but not entirely gone. And as the flames continue to rise, one thing becomes certain. The farewell is no longer symbolic. It is final. Fire does not rush, but it does not hesitate either. It works with a steady certainty, dismantling what was once a person piece by piece, until form gives way to heat, and heat gives way to absence. The crowd remains, because leaving early would feel inappropriate. Also, no one wants to be the one who missed the most important part after standing through all the speeches. So they watch. At first, the flames are dramatic, tall, loud, almost theatrical. But as time passes, the spectacle settles into something quieter, more relentless. The ship, if there is one, begins to collapse inward. The structure weakens. Wood splits, cracks, and falls. The carefully arranged items, once symbols of identity, lose their meaning as they blacken and disappear into the same fate. The body itself is no longer distinguishable, and this is where something shifts. Up until now, the dead person has still been, in a sense, present. Lying there, dressed, armed, surrounded by their belongings. Someone you could point to and say, there they are. But as the fire continues, that certainty vanishes. What remains is not a person, but a process. Transformation, if one prefers poetic language. Destruction, if one prefers accuracy. The living react in different ways. Some remain fixed in place, staring into the fire as if searching for something. Perhaps a sign, perhaps reassurance that this is working as intended. Others turn away, unable or unwilling to watch the final stages. There is no judgment either way. The ritual has done its job. What happens now is simply its conclusion. Smoke continues to rise, carrying with it what cannot be held. And with that rising smoke comes belief. The idea that the person is not gone, but travelling. That somewhere beyond sight, beyond flame and ash, they are arriving. Whether to Valhalla, to the quieter realm of Helheim, or somewhere in between depends on who they were, and perhaps who is telling the story. Eventually the fire begins to weaken. What was once a powerful blaze becomes glowing embers, then dimmer still. The noise fades, the heat softens, and in its place, there is only the remains, ash, fragments, proof that something ended here. And with that, the living are left with a final, uncomfortable realization. The person they knew is no longer here. Only memory remains. By the time the fire has exhausted itself, reduced from roaring spectacle to a bed of dim, stubborn embers, the crowd has thinned. The most patient remain, or perhaps the most obligated. Either way, someone has to deal with what is left, because even the most dramatic farewell eventually ends in a practical problem. Ash does not organize itself. The heat lingers, but the work begins. Carefully, deliberately, the remains are approached. There is no rush now. The urgency of earlier has passed, replaced by a quieter, more methodical task, collecting what survived the fire. And surprisingly, some things do. Fragments of bone remain among the ash, pale and brittle. Twisted pieces of metal, sword hilts, brooches, buckles, emerge blackened but intact. Fire may transform, but it is not perfect. It leaves behind reminders. Enough to gather, enough to recognize, enough to say, this is what remains of the person who stood here before. The process is not careless. It is handled with attention, sometimes even with a kind of reverence. Bones are selected and placed aside. Objects are retrieved if they can be. What was once scattered is now brought back together, though in a form far removed from anything familiar. These remains are not discarded, they are relocated, depending on custom and status. The collected bones and ashes may be placed in a burial mound, an urn, or a marked site. The mound itself becomes a new focal point, not for the dead who are considered gone, but for the living who require somewhere to remember, because memory, unlike fire, needs a location. Stones may be arranged, markers set. Occasionally, something more elaborate is built, particularly if the deceased held importance. A simple mound can become a statement, just as the funeral itself was. Not just someone died, but someone worth remembering died here. And yet, even as this final arrangement is completed, there is a quiet understanding among those present. This is not truly for the dead, it is for the living, a place to return to speak to stand beside and pretend, just for a moment, that distance is not quite as absolute as it feels. The fire has taken the body, the ritual has sent the spirit, and now all that remains is something far more fragile, a memory anchored to earth, held together by ash, stone, and the refusal to forget. With the ashes gathered, the mound raised, and the dead officially sent on their way, one might expect silence to follow, reflection, perhaps a long thoughtful pause. Instead, the Vikings eat. Because if there is one thing they understand, aside from fire, ships, and the occasional enthusiastic raiding, it is that life continues. And nothing confirms that quite like a table full of food and drink. The funeral feast begins. It is not a contradiction. It is the final part of the ritual. People gather again, but now the tone has shifted. The edge of grief has softened, replaced by something warmer, more grounded. Fires burn again, but this time for cooking rather than ceremony. Meat roasts, bread is passed, and ale flows with the kind of generosity that suggests moderation is not a priority. To an outsider it might seem strange, celebrating so soon after death, laughing even. But this is not disrespect, it is recognition. The dead are gone, the living remain, and the living must eat. Stories return, but now they are freer, less restrained. The earlier careful tone gives way to something more honest, or at least more entertaining. The deceased is remembered in detail. Victories grow larger, failures become amusing, and inconvenient truths quietly fade into the background. By the end of the evening, the person who died may bear only a passing resemblance to who they actually were. No one objects. This is how memory works here. Cups are raised again, this time not in ritual but in rhythm. Toasts are made to the dead, to the gods, to life itself. Each drink is a small acknowledgement that the world has not ended, even if it felt like it might have for a moment. And beneath it all, something more subtle is taking place. Bonds are reinforced, alliances are renewed, promises are made, some sincere, some conveniently vague. The gathering that began as a farewell becomes, quietly, a continuation of the social order. Death has not weakened the community. If anything, it has tightened it, because a Viking funeral is never just about loss, it is about transition. The dead move on to wherever they are meant to go, whether that is glory, shadow, or something in between. The living remain behind, carrying forward what matters, reshaping what does not, and reminding themselves, perhaps a little uncomfortably, that one day this entire process will repeat. And when it does, they will hope for the same thing, a good fire, a strong memory, and a feast worth attending.